Sofia Reyes, a young single mother, is thrust into a life-altering struggle after being assaulted by Daniel Grayson, the reckless son of her wealthy employer. Battling fear, poverty, and powerful forces determined to silence her, Sofia embarks on a courageous journey to seek justice and secure a future for her children. Sofia Reyes awoke before dawn, her small apartment still shrouded in darkness. The early morning was the only time she had to herself before the chaos of the day began. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake her 6-year-old son, Miguel, who lay curled up under a thin blanket in the next room. The apartment was modest, just 2 small rooms and a kitchenette, but it was all she could afford in the bustling city where every penny counted. As Sofia prepared a simple breakfast, her mind wandered to the day ahead. She worked as a caretaker for Mr. Grayson, an elderly billionaire who had long since retired from the public eye. The job wasn't glamorous, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent, food, and the mounting medical bills for her grandmother, who had been her only family since her parents passed away years ago. But it was a job, and in Sofia's world, that meant everything. Her life had never been easy. At 24, she had already faced more hardship than most people did in a lifetime. Becoming a mother at 18 had forced her to grow up quickly, and every decision she made was now for Miguel. He was her world, the reason she pushed through exhaustion and despair day after day. After getting ready, Sofia glanced at the clock. It was time to leave. She walked over to Miguel's room and gently shook him awake. "Come on, mi amor, it's time to get ready for school," she whispered. Miguel stirred, rubbing his eyes sleepily, and smiled up at her. His smile was the light in Sofia's often dark world. Once Miguel was dressed and ready, they left the apartment, stepping into the chilly morning air. The city was beginning to wake up, the streets gradually filling with people rushing to start their day. Sofia took Miguel to the small daycare nearby, where he would stay until she could pick him up after work. The daycare wasn't ideal, but it was affordable, and the staff were kind to Miguel, which was what mattered most to Sofia. Arriving at Mr. Grayson's mansion, Sofia felt the familiar mix of awe and discomfort she always experienced when she entered the grand estate. The mansion was a relic of old money, with its sprawling gardens and towering walls, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment she and Miguel called home. Inside, the rooms were filled with priceless antiques, and the air smelled faintly of polish and aged wood. Mr. Grayson was already awake, sitting in his favorite chair by the large bay window that overlooked the garden. Despite his wealth, he lived a life of solitude, with only a few trusted employees like Sofia to keep him company. His health had been declining steadily over the past few years, and he rarely left the mansion anymore. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Sofia greeted him with a warm smile. She had developed a routine with him, helping him with his meals, administering his medication, and keeping him company. Despite the difference in their social statuses, Sofia had grown fond of the old man, who, in his own gruff way, seemed to care for her too. "Morning, Sofia," Mr. Grayson replied in his raspy voice. He wasn't one for pleasantries, but over time, Sofia had learned to interpret the subtle changes in his tone. Today, he seemed tired, more so than usual. As she went about her tasks, Sofia's thoughts drifted to her grandmother, who had been diagnosed with a severe illness a few months ago. The medical bills were crushing, and Sofia had been doing everything she could to keep up with the payments. She had even considered taking on a second job, but the long hours at the mansion left her little time or energy for anything else. But no matter how hard things got, Sofia refused to give up. For her grandmother, for Miguel, she would keep going. It was what she had always done, and what she would continue to do, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. That evening, after a long day at work, Sofia returned home exhausted but grateful that Miguel was safe and sound. As she tucked him into bed, she whispered a silent prayer, asking for the strength to keep moving forward. Life was hard, but Sofia had learned to find light in the darkest of places. She had to, because Miguel depended on her, and she would do anything to protect him. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Sofia knew that tomorrow would bring the same struggles, the same fears. But she also knew she would face them head-on, just as she always had. For her son, for her grandmother, and for the hope of a better future. A cold wind swept through the empty streets as Sofia Reyes trudged home late that night. The city, usually so vibrant and full of life, felt eerily silent in the darkness. She pulled her worn coat tighter around herself, the chill seeping into her bones. The day had been long, and Sofia was exhausted. Her feet ached from hours of standing, and her mind was heavy with worry. But as she neared her apartment, the thought of seeing her son, Miguel, brought a small, tired smile to her lips. He would be asleep by now, but just knowing he was safe and warm gave her the strength to keep going. But that night, something was different. The unease started as a knot in Sofia's stomach, growing stronger with each step she took. As she passed through the grand, imposing gates of Mr. Grayson's mansion earlier, she had felt it, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. The mansion, usually a place of quiet solitude, had felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Mr. Grayson's son, Daniel, had arrived unexpectedly earlier in the day, his presence unsettling everyone. Daniel Grayson was nothing like his father. Where the old man was quiet and reserved, Daniel was brash, arrogant, and reckless. He had a reputation in the city for his wild behavior, leaving a trail of scandal and broken lives in his wake. Sofia had heard the stories, whispered among the other staff members, but she had never seen it firsthand until that day. When she arrived that morning, Daniel was lounging in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand even though it was barely past noon. His eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, followed Sofia as she entered the room. There was something predatory in his gaze that made her skin crawl. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her duties, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. The day dragged on, the atmosphere in the mansion growing more tense with each passing hour. Mr. Grayson had remained in his room, too ill to come downstairs, leaving Sofia to deal with his son's unwelcome presence. She kept her distance, doing her best to avoid Daniel, but it was impossible to ignore the way he leered at her, the crude comments he muttered under his breath whenever she passed by. As the evening wore on, Daniel's behavior became more erratic. He drank heavily, his mood swinging from sullen to aggressive in an instant. The staff, sensing the danger, kept their heads down, silently praying for the night to end. Sofia tried to remain invisible, focusing on finishing her work so she could leave as soon as possible. It was late when the incident happened. Sofia had just finished cleaning up in the kitchen when Daniel cornered her in the hallway. His face was flushed, and the smell of alcohol was overwhelming. "Sofia," he slurred, blocking her path. "Why don't you stay a while? Keep me company." Sofia's heart pounded in her chest, panic rising. "I need to get home, Mr. Grayson," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My son." But Daniel wasn't listening. He grabbed her arm, his grip tightening painfully. "Come on, don't be like that. You're always running off. Just one drink with me. What's the harm in that?" Sofia's mind raced as she tried to pull away. "Please, Mr. Grayson, let me go. I really need to." Before she could finish, Daniel yanked her closer, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. "I said stay." Terror flooded Sofia's senses. She struggled against his grip, but Daniel was stronger, his drunken state making him unpredictable and dangerous. The hallway was empty, the other staff members having left for the night, leaving Sofia alone with him. She opened her mouth to scream, but Daniel clamped a hand over her mouth, his eyes wild. In that moment, Sofia knew she was in real danger. She thrashed desperately, trying to break free, but Daniel only tightened his hold, dragging her into a nearby room. The world blurred as fear took over, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Sofia's mind screamed for her to fight, to escape, but her body was frozen with fear. The next few minutes were a nightmare. Daniel's laughter, his hands all over her, the room spinning around her as she struggled in vain. Sofia's strength was no match for his drunken rage. She felt the tears spill down her cheeks, her screams muffled by his hand. And then, suddenly, it was over. Daniel released her, pushing her away as if she were nothing more than a discarded toy. Sofia stumbled, her legs giving way beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling violently. She could barely breathe. her mind unable to process what had just happened. Daniel stood over her, his expression cold and indifferent, as if he had simply swatted a fly. "Get out," he snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "You can keep your job if you keep your mouth shut. Understand?" Sophia nodded numbly, too terrified to do anything else. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she grabbed her bag and fled the room. The mansion felt like a labyrinth as she ran, her vision blurred by tears, her mind screaming at her to get out, to get away. When she finally burst through the front door, the cold night air hit her like a slap to the face. She didn't stop running until she reached the end of the street, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but she was too afraid. Afraid of what Daniel might do if she told anyone, afraid of losing her job, afraid of what would happen to her son if she couldn't provide for him. Sophia staggered home, her mind reeling from the horror of what had just happened. She felt violated, broken, and utterly alone. The safety and warmth of her apartment felt like a cruel joke as she stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. For a long time, she just sat there, her body racked with silent sobs, her mind unable to comprehend the darkness that had just invaded her life. But even in her despair, one thought pushed through the fog of fear and pain. Miguel. She had to be strong for him. She had to keep going, no matter what. Wiping away her tears, Sophia forced herself to stand. She would get through this. Somehow, she would survive. For Miguel. The weeks following the assault were a blur of numbness and denial for Sophia Reyes. She moved through each day like a ghost, her mind refusing to process the horror of what had happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's cold, cruel face, heard his mocking laughter, and felt the weight of his power crushing her spirit. But she kept going, pushing down the pain and fear, because she had no choice. Miguel depended on her, and that was all that mattered. Sophia continued to work at Mr. Grayson's mansion, unable to find the courage to quit despite the terror that gripped her every time she stepped through those doors. She avoided Daniel as much as possible, and thankfully, he seemed to have lost interest in her, treating her with the same indifference as before the assault. But the fear lingered, a constant shadow that followed her every move. Then, one morning, everything changed. Sophia had been feeling unwell for days, but she had brushed it off as stress and exhaustion. After all, her life had been nothing but stress and exhaustion for as long as she could remember. But that morning, as she stood in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink, a wave of dizziness washed over her, stronger than before. Her stomach churned, and she barely made it to the toilet before she was violently ill. As she wiped her mouth with a trembling hand, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was impossible, that it had to be something else. But the thought wouldn't go away, gnawing at her until she couldn't ignore it any longer. With a sinking heart, Sophia realized she needed to know the truth. Later that day, after dropping Miguel off at school, Sophia made her way to a small pharmacy on the edge of the neighborhood. The place was empty, the clerk barely glancing at her as she grabbed the pregnancy test from the shelf, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She paid in cash, avoiding eye contact with the clerk, and shoved the test into her bag before hurrying out of the store. Back at her apartment, Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small plastic stick in her hand. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She didn't want to take the test, didn't want to know if her worst fears were true, but she had to. There was no running from this. With a deep breath, she took the test and then sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest as she waited for the result. Each second felt like an eternity, the silence in the room pressing down on her like a weight. Finally, the time was up. Sophia forced herself to look at the test, her heart in her throat. 2 lines. Positive. Sophia's world shattered in that instant. She stared at the test, unable to breathe, unable to think. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Daniel Grayson's child. The man who had violated her, who had threatened her into silence, who had the power to ruin her life in an instant. And now she was carrying his child. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, and Sophia collapsed onto the floor, her body racked with sobs. She felt trapped, suffocated by the enormity of her situation. How could this be happening? How could she possibly bring this child into the world? A child born out of violence, a child whose father was a monster. But even as the despair threatened to swallow her whole, Sophia knew she had to face the reality of her situation. She had no one to turn to, no one who could help her. Her grandmother was too sick to handle such news, and Miguel was too young to understand. Sophia was utterly alone. For days, Sophia kept the news to herself, carrying the secret like a heavy stone in her heart. She still went to work, still cared for Mr. Grayson, still pretended everything was fine. But inside, she was crumbling. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every moment was consumed by the thought of the life growing inside her and the horror of what it meant. Eventually, Sophia knew she had to confront Daniel. She couldn't keep this a secret forever, and she needed to know what he intended to do. Maybe, just maybe, he would take responsibility. Maybe he would help her, provide for her and the baby. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had. One evening, after putting Miguel to bed, Sophia made the difficult decision to confront Daniel. She waited until she knew he would be home. Late, after another night of drinking and gambling, no doubt. She had seen him returning to the mansion just as she was leaving, and the sight of him had filled her with dread. But she had to do this. For her unborn child, she had to try. Sophia approached the mansion with heavy steps, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt sick with fear, but she pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. The mansion was eerily quiet as she entered, the usual staff having left for the night. She found Daniel in the living room, sprawled out on the couch, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of mild irritation. "What do you want?" he slurred, barely coherent. Sophia took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. Daniel raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "About what?" Sophia clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady herself. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "It's yours." For a moment, there was silence. Daniel stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a cruel smile spread across his face. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent chills down Sophia's spine. "Pregnant?" he sneered, setting his glass down with a clatter. "And you think I'm going to believe that?" Sophia's heart sank. She had expected anger, maybe even denial, but the cold contempt in his voice was worse than anything she had imagined. "It's the truth," she insisted, her voice wavering. "You're the father, and you need to take responsibility." Daniel stood up, towering over her, his eyes dark with anger. "Listen to me, and listen good," he growled. "I don't care if you're pregnant. I don't care what happens to you, or that brat you're carrying. I'm not taking responsibility for anything." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as Daniel stepped closer, his presence menacing. "And if you think you can use this to get money out of me or my father, you're out of your mind," he continued, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll ruin you. I'll make sure you never work in this city again. You'll be out on the street, homeless and starving, with no one to turn to." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't want anything from you. Just help me provide for this child. It's your responsibility." But Daniel was unmoved. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, and spat out his final words with venom. "Get out of my sight, you worthless whore. And if you ever tell anyone about this, I'll destroy you." With that, he shoved her aside, turning his back on her as if she were nothing. Sophia stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the couch, her whole body shaking with fear and despair. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew it was useless. Daniel held all the power, and there was nothing she could do. Sophia fled the mansion, tears streaming down her face as she ran through the cold, empty streets. She had never felt so hopeless, so utterly defeated. Daniel had made it clear. He would do nothing for her or the baby, and he would use every resource at his disposal to ensure she suffered for even daring to confront him. When Sophia reached her apartment, she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of her situation crashed down on her, suffocating her with despair. She was pregnant, alone, and now without a job. There was no way she could continue working at the mansion after this, and without income, she and Miguel would soon be out on the streets. Sophia cried until she had no tears left, her body exhausted and numb. She didn't know how long she lay there, but eventually, the harsh reality of her situation forced her to move. She had to be strong. She had to survive, for Miguel, for the baby. But as she curled up on the floor, hugging herself for warmth, Sophia couldn't see a way out of the darkness that surrounded her. The future seemed bleak, a long tunnel with no light at the end. She was alone, and she had never felt so utterly powerless. The days and weeks that followed were the darkest Sophia Reyes had ever known. Each morning, she awoke with the crushing weight of her circumstances pressing down on her, and each night, she went to bed with that same despair lingering over her like a dark cloud. The realization that she was carrying Daniel Grayson's child was a constant, gnawing reminder of the night that had shattered her life. But now, she had to find a way to survive, for herself, for Miguel, and for the innocent life growing inside her. After being dismissed from her job at the Grayson mansion, Sophia found herself suddenly cut off from the meager income that had been their lifeline. Daniel had made good on his threat, ensuring that no one in the city would hire her. Every job application she submitted was either ignored or politely declined, and soon, her savings, already scant, began to dwindle to nothing. The bills piled up, and Sophia was forced to make painful sacrifices. The food on their table became less and less. The electricity in their apartment flickered on and off as she struggled to keep up with payments, and Miguel, though young, began to sense the fear and stress that hung over their small home. Sophia found herself retreating into the shadows, afraid to draw attention to herself or her situation. She avoided her neighbors, kept Miguel from asking too many questions, and spent hours every day scouring the city for any work she could find. But Daniel's influence seemed to reach everywhere. Even when she applied for menial jobs, the kind no one else wanted, she was met with closed doors. It was during one of these desperate days of searching that Sophia felt the first real pang of her pregnancy. It was a sharp, twisting pain that took her by surprise, stopping her in her tracks as she walked down a crowded street. She gasped, clutching her stomach, and leaned against a nearby wall, trying to steady herself. People passed by, indifferent to her struggle, their lives continuing as if nothing were wrong. Sophia waited for the pain to subside, but it lingered, a cruel reminder of the life growing inside her, a life she was terrified she wouldn't be able to care for. The fear that something might be wrong with the baby gnawed at her, but she had no money to see a doctor, no one to turn to for help. All she could do was endure, hoping and praying that the pain would pass. When she finally made it home that evening, Sophia found Miguel sitting quietly at the small kitchen table, coloring a picture. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with a smile that made her heart ache. "Mama, look. I drew a picture of us," Miguel said, holding up the drawing. It was a simple, childlike sketch of the two of them standing under a bright sun, holding hands. Sophia forced a smile, even as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. "It's beautiful, mi amor," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "You're so talented." Miguel hugged her back, his small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. "Are you okay, Mama?" he asked, his voice soft and full of concern. "You look tired." Sophia blinked back the tears, not wanting to worry her son. "I'm just a little tired, that's all," she said, kissing the top of his head. "But don't worry, everything will be okay." But even as she said the words, Sophia knew they were a lie. Everything was not okay, and she had no idea how to make it so. She was running out of time, out of options, and the despair she had been trying to keep at bay was beginning to consume her. That night, after Miguel had fallen asleep, Sophia sat alone in the dim light of their apartment, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She had to find work, had to find some way to support herself and her children, but every door seemed to be closing in her face. The city that had once held promise now felt like a prison, with Daniel Grayson's reach extending into every corner, ensuring there was no escape. Desperate, Sophia began to consider options she had never thought she would. She thought about leaving the city, starting over somewhere new, where Daniel couldn't find her. But where would she go? She had no money, no family or friends to turn to, and the thought of leaving behind everything she knew, no matter how bleak, filled her with dread. She also thought about asking for help, from the church, from charity organizations, from anyone who might listen. But the shame of her situation kept her from reaching out. Sophia had always been proud, had always tried to handle things on her own. But now, that pride was becoming a heavy burden, weighing her down when she needed to find a way to rise up. The days passed in a blur of hunger and exhaustion. Sophia grew weaker, the stress of her situation taking its toll on her body. She did her best to shield Miguel from the worst of it, but she could see the worry in his eyes, the fear that he didn't quite understand but could sense all the same. She knew she was running out of time, that something had to change before it was too late. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Sophia made a vow to herself and to the child she carried. She would survive this. She would find a way to protect her children, no matter what it took. She had already been through so much, had faced so many hardships, and she refused to let this be the end of her story. Sophia knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that she would have to fight for every inch of progress. But she also knew that she couldn't give up. Not for herself, not for Miguel, and not for the life growing inside her. She had to believe that there was a way out, even if she couldn't see it yet. The next morning, Sophia rose early, determined to keep going, to keep fighting. She took Miguel to the daycare and set out once again to find work, refusing to let the despair take hold. She knocked on doors, handed out resumes, pleaded with anyone who would listen. And though she faced rejection after rejection, she kept going, because she had no other choice. One afternoon, as Sophia was leaving yet another failed job interview, she was approached by an older woman who had been watching her from across the street. The woman had a kind face, lined with age and experience, and she walked with a slight limp as she crossed the road to meet Sophia. "Excuse me, dear," the woman said, her voice gentle. "I've seen you around here before, looking for work. Are you in need of help?" Sophia hesitated, her instinct to protect herself flaring up. But something in the woman's eyes, something warm and understanding, made her pause. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm in a very difficult situation." The woman nodded, as if she had already known the answer. "My name is Mrs. Martinez," she said. "I live just a few blocks away, in that old brick building on the corner. I used to run a small business, but I'm retired now. I don't have much, but I'd like to help you if I can." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat, the offer of kindness almost too much to bear. "Thank you, Mrs. Martinez," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Martinez replied, reaching out to gently pat Sophia's hand. "Just come by my apartment tomorrow morning, and we'll see what we can do. I know it's not much, but even a little help can make a big difference." Sophia nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. It wasn't a solution to all her problems, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She thanked Mrs. Martinez again, and as she walked home that evening, she felt a small flicker of determination reignite within her. The next morning, Sophia visited Mrs. Martinez's apartment as promised. The older woman welcomed her warmly, offering her a cup of tea as they sat down to talk. Mrs. Martinez listened patiently as Sophia shared her story, and though Sophia didn't reveal all the details, she told enough for the woman to understand the severity of her situation. Mrs. Martinez offered Sophia a small job, helping with errands and light housework, along with a modest wage. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for the first time in weeks, Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. She accepted the offer gratefully, and as she left Mrs. Martinez's apartment, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the end of her struggles, but it was a step forward. And as Sophia walked back to her apartment, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. She had found a small ray of light in the darkness, and now she had to hold on to it, to keep moving forward, no matter what. Sofia Reyes had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this time, the odds felt overwhelming. Every day was a fight for survival, and now, as her pregnancy advanced, she knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. The small job Mrs. Martinez had offered provided just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, but it was a far cry from the security she needed. Despite her determination to protect Miguel and her unborn child, the weight of their circumstances was crushing. But amid the darkness, a new resolve had begun to take shape within her. The injustice of what Daniel Grayson had done, the way he had violated her and then dismissed her as if she were nothing, burned like a fire in her chest. The thought of him going on with his life, untouched by the consequences of his actions, filled her with a rage she had never known before. It was time to fight back, to hold him accountable, no matter how powerful he was. Sofia knew it wouldn't be easy. Daniel was wealthy, influential, and connected to people who could ruin her with a snap of their fingers. But she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. She couldn't let Daniel get away with what he had done. To her, to their child, and to the other women she suspected he had hurt in the past. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to the monster who had taken so much from her. The first step was finding a lawyer, someone who would take her case despite the risks. It seemed impossible at first. Every lawyer she approached turned her away, either too afraid to go up against the Grayson family or too cynical to believe her story. Days turned into weeks as Sofia knocked on door after door, her hope dwindling with each rejection. But she refused to give up. One evening, after another long day of fruitless searching, Sofia sat on a bench in the park, her hands trembling with exhaustion and frustration. The park was quiet, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back, refusing to let herself break down. Just as she was about to leave, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You look like you could use some help." Sofia looked up to see a man standing a few feet away, his expression gentle but concerned. He was in his late 30s, with kind eyes and a warmth that immediately put her at ease. She hadn't noticed him approach, too lost in her despair to pay attention to her surroundings. "Are you okay?" the man asked, taking a cautious step closer. Sofia hesitated, unsure of whether to trust this stranger. But something in his demeanor told her he wasn't a threat. I'm fine," she lied, her voice shaky. The man didn't look convinced. "My name's David," he said, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm a lawyer. I couldn't help but notice you seem troubled. Is there something I can do?" The word lawyer caught Sofia's attention, and she felt a flicker of hope. "You're a lawyer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, his expression serious. "Yes, I am. And I've seen that look before. Like the world's on your shoulders. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Sofia hesitated again, the fear of opening up to yet another person gnawing at her. But the desperation in her heart outweighed her caution. She needed help, and this might be her last chance to find it. Taking a deep breath, Sofia began to tell David her story. She started with her job at the Grayson mansion, the assault, and the pregnancy that had turned her life upside down. She told him about Daniel's threats, her dismissal, and the relentless struggle she had faced since. As she spoke, the words tumbled out in a rush, as if a dam had broken inside her, and she couldn't stop them even if she wanted to. David listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. He didn't interrupt, letting Sofia get everything out, and by the time she finished, she was trembling with the intensity of it all. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of her story hanging in the air. Finally, David spoke. "Sofia, what happened to you is horrific, and it's clear that Daniel Grayson needs to be held accountable. But this won't be easy. He's a powerful man with powerful connections, and he'll fight back with everything he has. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Sofia met David's gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I have to," she said firmly. "He can't get away with what he's done. Not to me, not to our child, and not to anyone else he's hurt. I need to do this." David nodded, his respect for her growing. "Okay, if you're willing to fight, then I'm with you." I'll take your case." Relief washed over Sophia, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." David smiled gently. "We'll get through this together. I can't promise it will be easy, but I'll do everything in my power to help you." With David by her side, Sophia began the long and grueling process of seeking justice. The first step was gathering evidence, and this proved to be more difficult than she had imagined. Daniel had covered his tracks well, and many of the people who could have corroborated her story were either too afraid to speak out or had been bought off by the Grayson family. But Sophia and David persisted, knowing that they couldn't give up. They started by filing a civil lawsuit against Daniel, accusing him of assault, harassment, and wrongful termination. It was a bold move, one that drew immediate backlash from Daniel's powerful family. The Graysons launched a counteroffensive, accusing Sophia of being a liar and a gold digger, trying to smear her reputation in the media. They even hired private investigators to dig into her past, hoping to find something they could use against her. Sophia found herself thrust into the spotlight, her private life exposed for the world to see. The tabloids ran sensational headlines about her, twisting the truth and painting her as a villain. The pressure was immense, and there were moments when Sophia wondered if she had made a mistake in pursuing this battle. But every time doubt crept in, she thought of Miguel and the baby, and her resolve hardened. She couldn't let Daniel win. She couldn't let him ruin her life any more than he already had. The legal process was slow and brutal. There were endless meetings, depositions, and court hearings. Daniel's lawyers were ruthless, attacking Sophia at every turn, trying to discredit her and make her give up. But David was a skilled and compassionate attorney, and he fought tirelessly on her behalf, countering every move Daniel's team made. Throughout the ordeal, Sophia drew strength from the people who stood by her. Mrs. Martinez, though frail, offered words of encouragement and a listening ear when Sophia needed it most. Even Miguel, in his innocent way, kept her going with his smiles and hugs, reminding her why she was fighting in the first place. As the months dragged on, the case took its toll on Sophia. She was constantly exhausted, the stress of the lawsuit compounded by her pregnancy. There were times when she felt like she couldn't go on, when the weight of it all became too much to bear. But every time she reached that breaking point, she found a way to push through. She had to. There was no other choice. Then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Sophia received devastating news. The court had ruled in favor of the Graysons on a technicality, dismissing her lawsuit before it could even go to trial. The ruling was a crushing blow, and it felt like the final nail in the coffin of her hope. David was furious, but he kept a calm exterior as he explained the situation to Sophia. "We can appeal," he said, trying to reassure her. "It's not over yet, but I won't lie to you. It's going to be even harder now." Sophia listened, numb with shock and despair. She had fought so hard, endured so much, only to be shut down before she even had a chance to tell her story in court. It felt like the world was conspiring against her, like no matter how hard she tried, she would never escape Daniel's grasp. That night, Sophia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She had given everything to this fight, and now it seemed like it had all been for nothing. The thought of continuing, of appealing the case and going through more months of agony, felt impossible. She was so tired, so worn down, and she didn't know how much more she could take. But as she lay there, her hand resting on her swollen belly, Sophia felt a faint, fluttering movement. The baby was moving, reminding her that there was still life, still hope, growing inside her. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was enough to make her decision. Sophia wouldn't give up. She couldn't. Not when there was still a chance, however small, to hold Daniel accountable. She would appeal, and she would keep fighting, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it was. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about justice, about standing up for what was right, even in the face of impossible odds. With renewed determination, Sophia wiped away her tears and closed her eyes, preparing herself for the battle ahead. The road would be long and difficult, but she wasn't alone. And as long as she had the strength to keep going, she would. Sophia Reyes sat in the cramped office of David, her lawyer, staring at the papers scattered across his desk. The room was filled with the sound of ticking from an old clock on the wall, each second a reminder of how much time had passed since she first started this battle for justice. The appeal process was grueling, and although they had made some progress, it felt like the fight was never ending. Sophia was exhausted. Her pregnancy had progressed to the final trimester, and each day brought new challenges as her body grew heavier and more fatigued. The stress of the legal battle weighed on her constantly, making it hard to sleep, hard to eat, hard to even find the energy to take care of Miguel. She could feel the toll it was taking on her, and despite David's assurances, she was beginning to lose hope that she would ever see justice served. David sighed, leaning back in his chair as he rubbed his temples. "We've got a strong case for the appeal, Sophia, but the Graysons are pulling every string they can to delay this, to wear you down. They're hoping you'll give up." Sophia nodded, her eyes downcast. She knew he was right, but the thought of continuing this fight for another year, maybe longer, was overwhelming. "I'm just so tired, David," she whispered. "I don't know how much more I can take." Before David could respond, there was a knock at the door. His secretary poked her head in, looking slightly flustered. "Mr. Grayson is here to see you." David frowned, glancing at Sophia. "Which Grayson?" "Daniel," the secretary replied. "He's asking to speak with Ms. Reyes." Sophia's heart skipped a beat, fear and anger flaring up at the mention of Daniel's name. "I don't want to see him," she said quickly, her voice shaking. The thought of facing him again, after everything he had done, was unbearable. But the secretary shook her head. "Not Daniel, Ms. Reyes. It's Mr. Grayson Sr. He's asking to speak with you privately." Sophia and David exchanged a surprised glance. Mr. Grayson Sr., the same man she had worked for, the man who had always treated her with a distant kindness, wanted to see her? It was unexpected, to say the least. But Sophia couldn't ignore the curiosity that tugged at her. Why would he want to speak to her now, after all this time? "Should I let him in?" the secretary asked, sensing their hesitation. Sophia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Yes, let him in." The door opened a moment later, and there stood Mr. Grayson Sr. He looked older, frilier than she remembered, leaning heavily on a cane as he entered the room. His once commanding presence had diminished, and there was a weariness in his eyes that matched Sophia's own. He nodded politely to David before turning his attention to Sophia. "Ms. Reyes," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Sophia stiffened, unsure of what to expect. "Mr. Grayson," she replied cautiously, "what can I do for you?" Mr. Grayson hesitated, glancing at David, who nodded in silent understanding. "I'll step out," David said, rising from his chair. "But I'll be right outside if you need me, Sophia." Once they were alone, Mr. Grayson slowly lowered himself into the chair across from Sophia, his movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Mr. Grayson spoke. "I know what my son did to you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I know the pain and suffering it has caused you. I wish I could say that I was unaware, that I was oblivious to his behavior, but the truth is, I've known for some time that Daniel was troubled. I just didn't know how to stop him." Sophia listened in stunned silence, her emotions swirling. She had never expected Mr. Grayson to acknowledge what had happened, let alone express regret. But there was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her, that seemed genuine. "I've spent my life building an empire," Mr. Grayson continued, his gaze distant as if lost in memory. "But in the process, I failed as a father. I was too focused on wealth, on power, and I let my children grow up without guidance, without understanding the consequences of their actions. Daniel is the product of my failures." Sophia's heart ached as she listened to the old man's confession. She had never considered the possibility that Mr. Grayson might carry his own burdens of guilt and regret. But that didn't change what Daniel had done, or the impact it had on her life. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sophia asked, her voice quiet but steady. Mr. Grayson sighed deeply. "Because I'm dying, Ms. Reyes. The doctors say I don't have much time left. And before I go, I want to make things right, at least as right as they can be." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I can't undo what Daniel did to you, but I can offer you the financial support you need, and I can ensure that Daniel is held accountable." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "I've instructed my lawyers to settle your case," Mr. Grayson said, his tone firm. "You'll receive a substantial financial settlement, enough to provide for yourself, your son, and the child you're carrying. In return, I ask that you drop the lawsuit. I know it's not the justice you're seeking, but it's what I can offer." Sophia felt a rush of emotions, relief, anger, confusion, all at once. She had spent so long fighting, so long struggling to find justice, and now, here it was, handed to her in a form she hadn't expected. A settlement wouldn't hold Daniel accountable in the eyes of the law, but it would give her the means to start over, to provide a better life for her children. But was it enough? Could she walk away from this fight, knowing that Daniel might never face the consequences of his actions? As if sensing her hesitation, Mr. Grayson leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Ms. Reyes, but my son is dying. He doesn't have much time left either. And in his final days, he's asked to see you. He wants to make amends, to acknowledge your child as his. I don't know if that matters to you, but I thought you should know." Sophia's mind reeled. Daniel, dying? The news was a shock, something she hadn't anticipated. The man who had caused her so much pain, who had tried to destroy her life, was now facing his own mortality. And he wanted to see her? The thought filled her with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle: anger, pity, confusion, and a small, reluctant flicker of curiosity. "Why should I agree to this?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. "Why should I let him have any part in my child's life after everything he's done?" Mr. Grayson looked at her with a sorrowful expression. "Because it might bring you some closure. Because it might give your child some answers, someday, about where they came from. And because it might help you find peace." Sophia sat in silence, her mind racing as she considered his words. She had never imagined this turn of events, never thought that Daniel would be the one reaching out to her, seeking forgiveness, seeking to make things right. It felt surreal, almost impossible to believe. But as she looked into Mr. Grayson's tired, regretful eyes, she knew that this was a chance to close this chapter of her life and move forward, free from the shadows of the past. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to give her child a future that wasn't defined by the pain and trauma of their conception. Sophia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. "I'll meet with him," she said finally, her voice firm, "but I'm not making any promises." Mr. Grayson nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Reyes. I know this isn't easy, but I believe it's the right thing to do." Sophia stood, her legs trembling slightly as she prepared to leave. "I just want what's best for my children," she said quietly. "That's all I've ever wanted." "I understand," Mr. Grayson replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "And I hope, in some small way, this will help you find that." As Sophia left the office, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now the end was in sight. But what kind of ending would it be? Would this meeting with Daniel bring her the closure she needed, or would it open up new wounds? There was only one way to find out, and as she stepped out into the cool evening air, Sophia felt a sense of calm settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control of her destiny. She would face Daniel, and whatever happened next, she would face it with strength and determination. For herself, for Miguel, and for the child she carried. The day of the meeting with Daniel arrived far more quickly than Sophia Reyes had anticipated. As she stood outside the hospital, the cold air biting at her cheeks, she felt a strange mix of anxiety and resolve. The building loomed above her, its gray exterior as cold and unfeeling as the man she was about to face. But this was it, the moment that could finally bring her some semblance of peace. Inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the distant hum of machinery greeted her as she made her way to Daniel's room. The nurse who led her through the labyrinth of hallways offered a sympathetic glance, clearly aware of the situation but wisely choosing to remain silent. When they reached the door, the nurse paused, placing a gentle hand on Sophia's arm. "If you need anything, I'll be just outside," the nurse said softly, before leaving Sophia alone in front of the door. Sophia took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had fought so hard to get to this point, and now, standing here, she felt the weight of everything that had happened bearing down on her. But she couldn't turn back now. She had to face Daniel, not just for herself, but for her children. For the future she was determined to give them. With a final, calming breath, Sophia pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the harsh afternoon light. Daniel lay in the hospital bed, his once strong frame now gaunt and frail. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, and the lines of pain etched into his face were stark. The powerful, arrogant man who had terrorized her was gone, replaced by a figure who looked almost pitiful in his vulnerability. For a moment, Sophia just stood there, taking in the sight of him. It was hard to reconcile this dying man with the one who had caused her so much pain. But as she stepped closer, Daniel's eyes flickered open and recognition flashed in them. "Sophia," he croaked, his voice weak and rasping. It was clear that speaking took great effort, and he winced as he struggled to sit up slightly. Sophia remained silent, her emotions tightly controlled as she watched him. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, she found herself unsure of what to say. What could she say to the man who had shattered her life, who had left her to pick up the pieces alone? Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation, and for the first time since she had known him, his expression softened. He began, then stopped, coughing violently. Sophia instinctively stepped forward, but stopped herself, unsure if she should help. Eventually, the coughing subsided, and Daniel lay back, exhausted. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible, "for everything, for what I did to you, and for the way I treated you afterward. I was a monster." Sophia's heart twisted at the sight of him. This man who had once held so much power over her now reduced to this broken shell. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice steady. "You were." Daniel closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." Sophia stood there, the silence between them heavy with years of pain and regret. She had dreamed of hearing these words, of seeing Daniel brought low by the weight of his actions. But now that it was happening, the satisfaction she had expected to feel was absent. Instead, there was only sadness. Sadness for the man who had wasted his life, and for the damage he had done. "You hurt me," Sophia said, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "You took away my dignity, my security, and you almost destroyed my future. But I survived, Daniel. I survived, and I'm stronger now because of it. But that doesn't mean what you did was forgivable." Daniel nodded weakly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," he whispered, "and that's why. I wanted to do something for you. Something to try to make it right, even if it's too late." Sophia frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What are you talking about?" "My father. He's arranged for you to receive a large settlement," Daniel said, his voice faltering. "It's everything I have left. It's not enough to make up for what I did, but it's all I can offer." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She knew about the settlement Mr. Grayson had mentioned, but hearing it from Daniel himself, knowing it was coming from him, felt different. It wasn't just money. It was an acknowledgement of his guilt, a recognition that he owed her something. No, everything. "And the baby," Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to acknowledge them as mine. I don't know how long I have left, but they deserve to know where they come from." Sophia felt a pang in her chest at the mention of the baby, the child who was growing inside her, innocent and unaware of the circumstances of their conception. She had wrestled with the idea of what role Daniel would play in their life, if any, and now, here he was, asking to be a part of it, even if only in name. "I don't know if I can let you do that," Sophia said softly, her heart aching with the weight of the decision. "You're right. You don't deserve forgiveness. and I don't know if I can ever forgive you. But my child deserves to know the truth." Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for giving them that." Sophia stood in silence, her heart heavy with the enormity of what had just happened. She had come here seeking closure, and in some ways, she had found it. But there was no neat, tidy ending to this story. The pain would always be there. The scars would never fully heal. But she had survived, and now, she had a chance to move forward, to build a life for herself and her children that was not defined by what had happened to her. "I hope you find peace, Daniel," Sophia said quietly, turning to leave. "For your sake and for theirs." As she walked out of the room, Sophia felt a sense of finality settle over her. The chapter with Daniel was closed, and now she could focus on the future. A future where she and her children could live free from the shadows of the past. The settlement from the Graysons allowed Sophia to leave the city that had become a place of nightmares for her. She moved to a quieter town, far from the memories of Daniel and the mansion, and bought a small house where she and Miguel could start fresh. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs, a place where they could build a new life together. Sophia used part of the settlement to start an organization dedicated to helping other single mothers, particularly those who had been victims of abuse. She knew better than anyone how hard it was to escape the cycle of fear and poverty, and she wanted to use her experience to give others the support she had so desperately needed. The birth of her daughter, whom she named Lucia, brought Sophia a joy she hadn't felt in years. Holding her newborn daughter in her arms, Sophia knew that everything she had endured had been worth it. Lucia was a symbol of her strength, of the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Years passed, and Sophia watched with pride as Miguel and Lucia grew into strong, compassionate children. She told them the truth about their father when the time was right, answering their questions with honesty and grace. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary, and it brought them closer as a family. Sophia's organization flourished, helping countless women find their footing after the kind of trauma she had experienced. Her pain had been transformed into a force for good, and it gave her life a sense of purpose she had never imagined. And as she watched her children play in the backyard of their home, their laughter filling the air, Sophia finally felt at peace. The journey had been long and painful, but she had found her way to the other side. She had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, had created a legacy of hope and redemption that would live on in her children and in all the lives she had touched.